event for us. It's a great pleasure after so many years of work to have this book come out. And I would like to start by thanking Effie Steiner and Raya Evan David that just spoke, who were extremely helpful in the organizing and the decision making of this book launch. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank my three co-editors, Christian, Uri, and Luke, all of whom will be speaking tonight. We did a fabulous job and with whom it was a true pleasure to work. And lastly, I would like to thank the speakers. We have 7 of them for contributing their time and their thoughts to this event. The unfortunate piece of information I have to report is that Chaim Hames will not be joining us. Chaim is director of Ben-Gurion University, and we've had tensions in the dorms today. And apparently at this moment he's there. He called me a few minutes ago and apologized that he cannot make it. But he's taking care of some very urgent business, as we all can understand. But I would like to say one word about Chaim, because he's not just the rector of Ben-Gurion University, he's also the founder of the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters, which is the framework within which we have published this book. This center sponsored the conference Reading into Islamization, and it was during that conference that the 4 of us hatched this idea of this source book. And so, though he's not here, I would like to thank him for what he's done for us. And at this point, we'll move on to I'll start introducing the speakers. The way it's going to work is that we have 3 periods in the source book, and each one of the speakers wrote a introduction to the period, to one of the 3 periods, and they will speak about the periods and some of the major issues that come up. And then one of the contributors will present the text that they have translated and explain a little bit about the interest that this text raises. And the main point, both of this source book and of this evening, is to get across a sense of the experience of conversion. And I'm sure that my co-editors will talk about it, so I don't want to take up any more time and just would like to move on. And so we will start with Christian and later Peter Webb. I'll introduce Christian. Christian Sahner is an associate professor of Islamic history at the University of Oxford and a fellow at St. Cross College. Along with Conversion to Islam in the Premodern Age, a source book, which is our book, of which he served as co-editor, he is the author of Among the Runes, Syria Past and Present, which was published in Oxford 2014, and Christian Martyrs Under Islam, Religious Violence and the Making of the Muslim World, which was published at Princeton 2019. His research deals with late antique and early Islamic history, relations between Muslims and non-Muslims, and the histories of Iran, Syria, and the Islamic West. Christian, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nimrod. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good, good. Well, anyway, hello from Oxford. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Nimrod has just said, this work has been a great labor of love, with an emphasis on love more than labor. We've been at it for quite a while, and it's been a team effort, not only among the 4 of us, but among our many, many brilliant contributors who gave up their time to make this the source book so rich. You'll hear a lot about this book. My goal is to basically introduce the first section, which I had the pleasure to co-edit with Nimrod. So Nimrod is going to be our MC tonight, and I'll tell you about the section that he and I worked on. The only other thing I want to say, and what makes me very excited about this book, is that it is very much designed as a resource not only for research, but also for teaching. We hope that this book will be a stimulus for all of you and your colleagues far and wide to think about incorporating conversion to Islam as a topic into your teaching materials. And I've had the pleasure of test driving this with my students here in Oxford. And if I may say, as the editor co-editor of this book, I think it's a great success. It really lends itself to teaching. The students seem to like it. And if you choose to use it in the classroom, I hope yours will too. The first section of this book covers the formative period of Islamic history, by which I mean the 7th to 10th centuries of the Common Era. All of you will know this is an extremely important period in Islamic history. This is a moment in which the Muslim community goes from being a persecuted sect, as it was in the early years in Mecca, to the rulers of a true world empire. And conversion as a major theme runs through all of this. This is the era in which we see the conversion of the Arab tribes, beginning in the lifetime of the Prophet and continuing after. This is a period that witnesses early conflicts between Arab and non-Arab Muslims, especially in the Umayyad period, the theme of the Mawali. And then finally, this is the era that brings us to the Abbasid Caliphate, a time which is often associated with the creation of a cosmopolitan, highly mixed Muslim society. Again, that society is very much a consequence of this long-term process of conversion. We'll hear more about one of these special texts in a minute from Peter Webb, but I want to give you just a very quick overview of the kinds of materials that you'll find in this first section, and then I'll wrap up with some very broad conclusions about what I think is interesting, the big themes that jump out to me. Our section has about 20 to 25 sources. Some of these are the earliest texts about conversion in the Islamic tradition, as well as narratives of some of the earliest moments of conversion, albeit remembered from a later period. So we have a wonderful contribution by our colleague Abdullah Saeed on the Quran. What does the Quran have to say about conversion, or not, as the case may be? We have two fantastic entries from Sean Anthony and Michael Lecher, both from the Sirah, the biographical traditions about the Prophet. We have two wonderful contributions from the Tabaqat work of Ibn Sa'ad. This is the major early biographical collection from the 9th century. And these come from Karen Abu Hershkovitz, as well as Ella Landau Tesseron, known, I think, to this audience extremely well. And then finally, from that very early period, we have a nice selection of early Islamic poetry containing reflections on the experience of religious change. And Peter will talk about this in more detail in just a second. These are mainly narratives about the experience of conversion, but along with these, we have excerpts from some of the earliest legal sources about conversion. So my colleague here in Oxford, Christopher Melcher, has contributed a selection from the Musannaf, the early hadith collection of Ibn Abi Shayba. Yohanan Friedman has done something similar with another early hadith collection, that of Al-San'ani, and really interesting details about the experience of conversion from the responsa of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the great jurist of the early to mid-9th century. In our section, indeed, throughout the entire book, I think one of the great strengths is the mixture of Islamic as well as non-Islamic sources that we've tried to include. So as a result, the section contains a diversity of perspectives on conversion as seen through the eyes of the communities who benefited, that is to say the Muslims, as well as the communities who lost members, namely the non-Muslims. And as a result of this kind of symphony of perspectives, religious backgrounds, etc., we also have a great diversity of languages in this section and throughout the book. Translation of sources from Greek, from Syriac, Armenian, Latin, as well as Pahlavi. Our section contains a number of early non-Islamic narratives of conversion. These are the kinds of sources that were made famous through the work of Patricia Crona and Michael Cook in Hagerism, and later by Robert Hoyland in Seeing Islam. So we have fascinating accounts of early converts from the 7th century as told by Anastasius of Sinai, a very famous Greek-speaking Christian monk active in Egypt and the Levant at this time. And also close to my heart, we have a number of conversion narratives that come from Christian martyrdom accounts. These are stories of apostates, people who often converted to Islam and then went back to their original faith. Two in particular, one from Johannes Palic from 8th century Syria, and the other from Ken Wolfe, who I know is on the call. And these are his recent and wonderful translations from the Cordoba Martyred Acts. I mentioned a minute ago how we have Islamic legal sources. We also have early non-Muslim legal accounts of conversion. law was a major way in which clerical elites attempted to regulate the process of conversion, and these texts provide incredible details on what may have been the social reality behind it that we can't see otherwise. So for instance, we have a contribution by Jack Tounous from Jacob of Edessa, the very famous late 7th, early 8th century Syriac-speaking churchman, and a series of translations from Pahlavi that I have done. These are Zoroastrian legal texts that speak about many of the same issues: conversion, apostasy, religiously mixed families. And finally, and I'm not being comprehensive here in the overview of the section, we have a number of nice translations that tell us about major actors or major experiences of conversion as told through Islamic chronicles. So for instance, Gerald Hawting here in the UK has given us a nice translation about the Caliph Omar II in the famous case of the Mawali, the non-Arab freedmen of the early Islamic period who converted to Islam, but very often found themselves treated as second-class citizens. Michael Hooperson at UCLA gives us a wonderful translation about early Zoroastrian courtiers of the Abbasid period and their experience of conversion. And finally, Barbara Rochema gives us a nice treatise, or a snapshot of a treatise by the famous East Syrian intellectual and translator Hunayn ibn Ishaq, in which he explains his reasons for not converting. So there we see the process kind of in reverse. So that's an overview of many, but by no means all of the sources you'll find in section 1. But I want to conclude, and this is my very final point, what I find interesting about conversion from the book, and in particular from this section. We make the point in our introduction that Islam is unique among the great religions of the world in the sense that it really foregrounds conversion as a central aspect of its identity. As many of you will know, the word Islam, al-Islam in Arabic, is a verbal noun that comes from the very word that is used to describe conversion, aslama, to submit, which we take as, which of course is the standard word in Arabic for to become a Muslim. So the idea that the name of the religion coincides with this process of an experience of religious change is, I think, significant. For the early period, the central drama is, of course, how an Islamic empire established in the wake of the conquest came to be gradually filled by a Muslim society within those borders. The elusive Muslim majority that many of us are interested in and has been the object of much speculation would arise in a later period, but that process of reconciliation between an Islamic polity and an Islamic society within that polity, of course, begins early on in the period on which Nimrod and I focused. And very finally, a major theme that comes out of the book in general is how our understanding of conversion within history is heavily dependent on the types of sources that we consult, and especially the ways in which our understanding is captive to genre. So there are formulaic ways in which conversion is represented. We as historians have to be attentive to these genres and their conventions if we want to pierce the source space and try to the best of our ability to figure out what was happening. So I hope I haven't spoken too long. That's an overview of section 1. I'm really pleased that there are all these people on the call. I'm pleased to be with all of our contributors. And I think I will hand it back to Nimrod, who will then introduce Peter Webb. So thanks, everyone.
So thank you very much, Christian. Thank you for the wonderful overview and the insights. And we will move on now to Peter. Peter Webb is a university lecturer in Arabic literature and culture at Leiden University. His research investigates the evolution of Arab identity and Muslim narratives of pre-Islamic history, as developed in pre-modern Middle Eastern writings. Peter is the author of Imagining the Arabs, Arab Identity and the Rise of Islam, published at Edinburgh 2016, and has edited and translated works for the Library of Arabic Literature, including an edition of Ibn Battah's Shah al-Uyun, forthcoming in 2022. He is currently a principal investigator of a Venny research grant from the Netherlands Organization of Scientific Research. The topic is Epic Pasts, Pre-Islam Through Muslim Eyes. And the publications of that group include a study of pre-Islamic outlaws, his stories, The Arab Thieves, Al-Makrizi's Lusus al-Arab, which was published by Brill in 2019. And prior to his academic career, Peter was a solicitor at Clifford in London. Peter, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Nimrod. And you can also confirm that you can hear me. Is this all working? Excellent, good. Okay, so as Christian mentioned, my contribution to this book was a selection of poems. There were early Arabic poems composed around the dawn of Islam. And sort of how did I get there? Sort of to introduce it to you, well, when Christian and Nimrod invited me to contribute to the volume, I sort of was trying to think of what might be appropriate. And what came to my mind immediately was a statement made by a 9th century Iraqi scholar, Ibn Qutayba. And he said in one of his writings, he says, Lil Arab ash-sha'r, which basically means poetry is the Arabs. And so from the perspective of Arabic writing and Muslim sources, the Arabs were considered a people of poetry. Poetry memorializes the major events in their lives, memorializes the major events of their community, and it is the media by which people mused upon sort of topics of life and its consequences. And so it occurred to me that it would be worth wondering how Arabic poets responded to conversion to Islam in their works. And so I set about sort of looking for conversion poetry. And one of the things that was intriguing was that actually there's very little poetry about conversion in Arabic, relatively speaking, which is intriguing because at the time of the dawn of Islam, there was plenty of poetry composed. And so evidently poetry was not the common medium to express feelings about conversion. And I think that observation itself is interesting for its unexpectedness. But I want to talk about what I did do and not what I didn't find. And so we will see if we can focus on that as well, because if you look hard enough and if you look in the right places, you can find some material in poetry that is relevant to conversion. And what maybe you could sort of epitomize it by saying there's sort of a tiny subgenre of conversion poems that are sitting amongst various texts that were written in the 9th and 10th centuries. And so one of the poems I want to read today is just a short example of one of these, and then we'll go on to a second one in a moment. But these sort of conversion poems, they all seem to be relatively similar in as much as they're quite short, they're very straightforward, and they introduce us to some key themes, and they kind of share a bunch of key themes. One of them, and I guess none of these would be quite surprising, but one of them is a rejection of idol worship. Another theme that they like to talk about is the abstinence from drinking wine, dropping wine drinking. And then also quite prominent in the poetry, and I think rather important given the debates about the history of early Islam, is there's quite a lot of expression of personal fealty, both to Muhammad and to the one God. So as an example of kind of how these themes work in a poem, I'll give you one written by or composed by a poet named Khuza'i ibn Abd Nuhm. He was a custodian of an idol known as Nuhm in the pre-Islamic period. And what he does in a poem is he kind of sets the scene of his conversion. So the poem reads, I went to Nuhm to slaughter before it, ritual offering as I used to do. But I said to my soul as its reason returned, you fools, is this God true? I refused. Today my faith is Muhammad's, of heaven's glorious Lord, the giver of grace. So there's a bunch of little poems like these, and here sort of Khuza'i expresses conversion as a radically transformative experience, which is something that Christian has just alluded to in his introduction. And so it sort of follows through with how Islam would be perceived a little bit later. So one issue with these poems is the conversion poems that I looked at tended to cluster in books that were specialized on the history of early Islam. So for instance, Ibn Sa'ad's Tabaqat that Christian mentioned. And so talking about genre and the idea of archetype, there might be an issue that some of the poems that we count as sort of the conversion experiences of people at the dawn of Islam might have been molded by later Muslim narrators. And so there's kind of a textual criticism to look at these poems in further detail. But the interesting thing about poetry is that it spreads much wider. And so you can find sources about, or sort of poems alluding to conversion in places that aren't necessarily specialized Islamic history books. And these add a little bit more contour to the feelings that were involved in conversion. And I want to just read one today by a poet named Ibn Muqbil. Ibn Muqbil was a pre-Islamic, famous pre-Islamic poet. He lived sort of much of his life in the period before Islam, but then he converted to Islam. However, there were some misgivings about the sincerity of Ibn Muqbil's belief. And what I'll read to here is a section about him by the compoetry specialist Ibn Salam al-Jumahi. So Ibn Salam says in his biography of Ibn Muqbil, Ibn Muqbil was unsettled in his faith. During Islam, he would lament the people of pre-Islam and reminisce. And once he was asked, why do you cry over the people of pre-Islam, yet you are a Muslim? And Ibn Muqbil replied, and this was his little poem, why shouldn't I weep over vanished abodes and their people? The kings of Himyar and Ak used to visit them. From everywhere, sand grouse descended on our good wells. They exhausted our camels' refuges and took off. All right, so Ibn Muqbil's poem is about metaphors, and these lend themselves to multiple interpretations. So we think about Himyar and Ak, these are that he refers to. These are pre-Islamic Yemeni kingdoms. And so the poet obviously is invoking a nostalgia of a time past. And we might wonder, is he lamenting that sort of pre-Islamic kingship was more glorious than the Islamic version of the Caliphate? The sand grouse metaphor seems to intend Muslims. It's projecting them as new arrivals, potentially greedy new arrivals. And does he intimate by this that they were greedy and that the fiscal appropriations by the Caliphate were something he opposed? Or maybe did Ibn Muqbil disapprove of the rise to prominence of groups whom he considered to be inferior? A little bit of background. Ibn Muqbil was a kinsman of the Amir ibn Sa'sa'a lineage, and this particular group wielded a tremendous amount of power in the decades before Islam in the area of Medina and into Central Arabia. And of course, the power of the Amir ibn Sa'sa'a in that region was lost to the Caliphate, and so is Ibn Muqbil resenting that aspect of political change. A little bit more context, Ibn Muqbil also has another kinsman known as Labid. He was also a very famous poet, pre-Islamic, converted to Islam, and Labid's poetry expresses no qualms about conversion. And so maybe it was just Ibn Muqbil's personal view that conversion was not a positive, transformative experience. And that's what produced the poem that we have today. These are all quite open questions. And I think I'll just close this short little talk by reading the poem again to kind of leave you with the ideas with that background in mind. And then I'll read it to you in Arabic just so you can have a bit of the original flavor. So once again, why shouldn't I weep over vanished abodes and their people? The kings of Himyar and Ak used to visit them. From everywhere, sand grouse descended on our good wells. They exhausted our camels' refuges and took off. And in Ibn Muqbil's own words, وما لي لا أبكي الديار وأهلها وقد زارها زوار عق وحميرا وجاء قتل الأجباب من كل جانب فوقع في أعطاننا ثم طيرا. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for taking us into the kernel of Arab culture, which is poetry, of course, and for presenting one of the issues that are not very often get our attention, and that is the pain of that which these converts leave behind, and the weeping and so on. So thank you for shedding some light on this fascinating issue. And now we move to the second part, to the second period, and we move to Uri Simonsohn and to Negin Yavari. Uriel Simonsohn is a senior lecturer at the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of Haifa. He is the author of A Common Justice, The Legal Allegiances of Christians and Jews under Early Islam, and has just completed a book manuscript tentatively titled Kinship and Community, Female Power and Religious Change in the Medieval Near East. Uri, please.
Thank you very much. It's good to see everyone, and it's good to celebrate the launch of this book, which has finally come out. And it was indeed, I agree with my colleagues, it was indeed a very enriching and educational experience, and I'm grateful for that. I took charge of what we decided to call the Islamic Commonwealth period, which covers the mid-10th century till the mid-13th century. Before I share with you some remarks about the text and their significance in this particular section, I want to start with a few statistical facts. They're really meaningless because this is not a systematic survey of anything, and you won't be able to compare it to anything else, but I think the figures are impressive in themselves, and I think similar figures and similar diversity could be extracted from the other sections as well, but I decided to focus on mine. So, for instance, in my section, there were 17 contributions, 9 of which were of text of Muslim provenance, 7 of Christian provenance, including Coptic, Syrian Orthodox, Melkite, and Armenian, and 3 of Jewish provenance. There are 11 texts that were written in Arabic, 3 in Hebrew, 2 in Syriac, 1 in Persian, 1 in Classical Armenian, and 1 in Latin. Well, it's a contribution that consists of a number of texts, some of them in Latin, some of them in Old French. Then we have 5 contributions that belong to what we titled as the legal genre. 4 of historiographic nature, 3 hagiographic, 2 polemical, 2 epistolary, 1 geographic, and 1 apocalyptic. 4 are from Egypt, 3 are from Syria, 3 from Iraq, 3 from northern Mesopotamia, the Maghreb, 1 from Armenia, and 1 from Fars, and 1 from Al-Andalus, and from the Volga, and from Anatolia. So quite a rich mix of text, I think in itself is something that is about the significance of this endeavor. I want to now move on to a few general remarks about the historical significance of these texts, for the broader story of Islam or the Islamicate, and some more conversion-related specific. Moving into the issue of conversion to Islam, I think many of these texts are actually to what we know about this period. There's a period that, for instance, is known for migrations and movement of populations. Some of them were of Turkish origins, and this shows up in some of the texts. A period that, culturally speaking, witnessed the proliferation of an Iranian cult culture. Shows up in our texts. And the fact that we have quite a few texts from non-Muslim communities, not only of course, the interest of these communities in the phenomenon of conversion to Islam, but also to their vitality and their endurance under Muslim rule and their ability to produce such a rich corpus of documents. And of course, another feature that has been discussed much in modern scholarship is, and I think that also comes up very much from our sources, is the consolidation of communal institutions and the formation of categories, legal categories, and what one may call the entrenchment of communal boundaries. Specifically related to the phenomenon of conversion to Islam, I want to focus on 2 particular phenomena. The first has to do with what we are witnessing as the gradual fragmentation of an imperial unity. The fact that the Islamic world of the 10th, more so in the 11th century, is experiencing a gradual fragmentation into separate political entities, first and foremost seen in the formation of Shi'i regimes across the Mediterranean, Fertile Crescent, and Arabia, the rise to power of military elites, hand in hand with the phenomenon of a decline, actually, of political authority and a rise of clerical authority. The rise of clerical authority is witnessed also in the establishment of madrasas and the canonization of traditions and consolidation of legal schools. Now, I mentioned the legalization of a variety of traditions and principles in a formal way that shows up in a very rich selection of legal treatises. All these stand in the background of a much stricter enforcement of what some might typify as anti-dhimmi regulations. We find that under the Abbasids, for a short while under the Fatimids, and in other parts of the Islamic world, and much of it has been attributed to the dominance of clerical circles. Accordingly, we should read into such texts as the foundation of Sheikh Abu Ishaq Qazaruni's Congregational Mosque, that was translated by Najwin Yavari, who's here with us today, and the text that shows up in Michael de Siren's historiographic work about the conversion of the Turks by translated by Maria Conterno, and by another series of passages from that were translated by Daniela Talmon Hillel, titled Anecdotes about Conversion in 12th Century Syria. Finally, also the conversion tales in the Vita of Sheikh Abdallah al-Yunini, translated by Daphna Ifat, all of which speak of missionary activities, very much in line with the rise and the strengthening of clerical power. And aside to that, we can read into the conversion to Islam under the Fatimid Caliph of Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah that was translated by Mark Swanson, the history of the Alexandrian patriarchs of Alexandria, and also a text titled Conversion from Motive of Expediency that was translated by Debbie Tor, taken from Ibn al-Jawzi, speaking of the coercion or the pressures exerted on non-Muslim communities, perhaps to convert, or at least to fall under the superiority of the Islamic government. We think about moments of conversion very much in the context of this rise to power of clerical circles. Another phenomenon that is, I think, very much conducive to the phenomenon of conversion in this period is actually the obverse of coercion and rigid enforcement of anti-dhimmi regulation. And that is, in fact, the highly social and socially integrated world in which these communities find themselves. And this very much has to do with the dissemination of economic and political assets among the elites, military aristocracies, and strongmen, the flourishing and expansion of urban centers, and the ethnic composition of the Islamic world, which included not only Arabs, but also Iranians, Berbers, Armenians, Turks, Slavs, and more. And finally, the infiltration of Western elements through the Crusades, were creating a very rich mosaic of people, ethnicities in constantly expanding urban centers that very much facilitated interfaith encounters, social encounters among faiths, and to an extent also conversion that resulted from those social interactions. Now, I'm running short of time, and I won't be able to list the names of all the works that I feel that very much correspond to these trends, but I would like to indicate that in response to these social interactions that resulted with much conversion, we can find polemic treatises, we can find hagiographic texts or martyrology ones that actually are directed internally towards these communities in an attempt to safeguard communal boundaries and retain believers within their fold. It is also in this context where we find an elaborate set of regulations, such as the notarial forms that the conversion of non-Muslims in Al-Andalus, and also the principles that were dictated by Ibn Rushd al-Jad regarding what Maribel Fierro has titled Conversion, Confession, Prayer, and Apostasy. And it's also in this period that the non-Muslims are responding with their own legal endeavors, such as the response of the Babylonian Geonim, who are responding to, we can't say really the scope of the phenomenon, but nonetheless a very noticeable one, and that is the conversion of Jews to Islam. So overall, what we're looking here, and I don't presume to say this is distinctive of the so-called Commonwealth era, as opposed to the earlier or later ones, but I think we are witnessing some very interesting features that recur and sometimes are more emphasized in one period over another. And that is the fact that conversion is, of course, not a strict spiritual or religious phenomenon, but in fact, a very social one. And it is also a historical phenomenon that allows us to say more about the region, the time, and the people that engaged with it. So one thing would be, of course, a mirror to clerical power. The that we find are reflecting aspects of urbanism. They reflect ethnic and religious diversity and the affinity between political and religious powers, not to mention the significance of social mobility. And at the same time, they remind us of the vitality of non-Muslim communities through Muslim regulation and non-Muslim literary endeavors. Finally, we are faced once again with features of liminality, the enduring family ties of converts who direct their writings in more than one direction, movement of missioners, movement of texts, multiple affiliations of the individual, such as ethnicity, religion, settlement, linguistic, and social commitments. So what I try to do is really share with you, first of all, the diversity and the richness of this collection, but at the same time, there's significance of these texts, not just for conversion to Islam, but also for saying something about Islamic history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uri. Thank you for these very interesting thoughts and raising these important historic changes that occurred during the 10th to 13th century and how they play into questions of conversion and the historical context of these dynamics. And now we will move to Negin Yavari. Negin Yavari studied medieval history at Columbia University. Her book on the rhetoric of advice in medieval political thought, called Advice for the Sultan, Prophetic Voices and Secular Politics in Medieval Islam, published with Oxford University Press and Hearst at 2014, is a comparative study of mirrors for princes from the European and Islamic worlds. Mirrors for Princes Across Political and Spatial Divides is the subject of her co-edited volume, Global Medieval, Mirrors for Princes Reconsidered, published with Harvard University Press in 2015. Her latest book, entitled The Future of Iran's Past, Nizam al-Mulk Remembered, published with Oxford University Press, Hearst at 2018, is a biography of the prominent 11th century vizier. So, Negin, the floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to begin by thanking all the 4 editors for including me in this project. Really, I mean, I think I can say that we couldn't, and I'm sure all the other contributors, we couldn't have wished for better editors. They were supportive and available, and I thoroughly enjoyed the process. And I think the end product reflects so much of your hard work. So thank you, Uri, thank you, Luke, thank you, Nimrod, and thank you, Christian, for your supervision of this. And I also want to pick up, I want to say a few words, and I never succeed in doing that. So Uri, again, you're going to be my editor, and raise your hand when I go over 5 minutes, please, because I can get carried away talking about conversion from now till tomorrow morning.
Again, you have 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yes,
okay,
so you can get carried away.
All right, so somebody please tell me, somebody on the top of the screen that I can see, because I have my notes here, so I can't see you, Nimrod, but I can say Yuri if you just raise your hand, but I'll try and be brief. So I want to pick up on one of the points that Uri presented in his discussion, and that is the genre of texts. I mean, when we look for conversion narratives, where do we look, and in what time period do we look? I mean, clearly the hagiography from which my selection was excerpted was written in the 14th century, so that in a way, you know, the narrative, the story of conversion is crystallizing after the completion of the conversion process itself. And I mean, so that, you know, there's a gap between the act of conversion and writing about that conversion. And I think that gap is crucial to conceptualizing the study of the process of conversion, because you will find much, or at least I have found much of the same going on in Europe, medieval European accounts of conversion to Christianity. So when we study conversion, what it is that we are studying? Are we studying the change of religion, or are we studying the intensification of faith as from within an individual religious community? And the text that I worked with, the Firdaus al-Murshidiyya, is a hagiography, a 14th century hagiography of an 11th century sheikh. And as Yuri pointed out, those, I mean, the 11th century is really when the conversion process, the vast majority of the people in living under Islamic rule have converted to Islam. And it is the period that Richard Willett has called the rise of Islamic society, so that the apparent decline and the centrifugal sort of history that we see on the political level is really, can also be told at the same time, and with perhaps even more analytical depth, as the story of the rise of Islamic societies and Islamic institutions. And hagiographies and local histories and accounts of the etiology of a community is part of that process of institutionalization. Now, in that regard, then, what drew me first to the study of Firdaus al-Murshidiyya was the way in which the sheikh keeps going back to God, or to his followers, or to the forces, or whatever it is that we want to call it, for support in his cause. In other words, I mean, there is in a way very similar to the story of Muhammad himself when he and the conquest of Mecca, so that nothing materially really changes on the ground, but it is when his faith has intensified to an acceptable degree that God allows for the conquest, that you see that same process going on in the Firdaus. So the sheikh keeps coming back, and you know, and the Zoroastrians rebuild their sort of take down his mosque, and the mosque is only finally availed by the maturity of his faith and the maturity of his obedience to the will of God. So that I think what the text clearly points to is that without the rhetorical apparatus, it is the story of conversion, the history of conversion is really incomplete. And I think that one of the strengths of the source book that you have provided is to present the multiple elements, that the constituent elements of any conversion as a historical process. It's social as well as it's legal, as well as it's even sort of cultural overtones, and that comes across very well in the text, precisely because there is a very explicit gap in the history of the period in which the text is written versus the history of the period in which the subject of the text lived. And in other words, by the time it's written, there is, of course, we cannot read Mahmud ibn Uthman's hagiography as a story of conversion in the strict sense, because of course he wrote way after the conversion was completed in the vast majority. I mean, conversion was not an issue or non-Muslim communities were not an issue in 14th century, in the 14th century Islamic world. And the use of conversion as, like what's important to an account of conversion, in other words, I think that is at the heart of his hagiography, so that when people talk about conversion, is it a history of, like they encounter Jews and they encounter Zoroastrians, or they encounter non-Muslims, and then that sparks an account of conversion? Or is the history of conversion really the history of the Islamic society itself? And that is what at least drew me to the text. So thank you again for the opportunity to work on this, and I look forward to listening what everybody else has to say.
Thank you very much, Negin. Thank you for these comments that place the hagiography at the center and show us as historians the potential that we can do with when working with the hagiographies, and for the methodological remarks that you've just made. And now we will move to the third part, the 13th to 16th centuries. And there we will hear from Luc, who will present the overview, and from Antonio Bosanquet, who will give us a drill into one case. So Luc Yarbrough is Associate Professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. He is currently co-organizer of the research group Cultural Brokerage in Premodern Islam at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is the author of Friends of the Emir, Non-Muslim State Officials in Premodern Islamic Thought, published with Cambridge at 2020, and the editor and translator of The Sword of Ambition, Bureaucratic Rivalry in Medieval Egypt, with NYU 2016. Luc, please.
Thank you very much, Nimrod. Am I audible to everyone? Okay, very good. Thank you all so much for attending. I want to thank, before I say just a few things, I want to thank Effie, Chaim, Nimrod, Uri, and Christian, these consummate professionals as co-editors and assistants with this project, as well as Raya and Bat El, who also played an important part going all the way back to 2016 with the conference that launched it all. I also want to do something that surprisingly for a book launch hasn't been done yet, which is to put a link to the book itself into the chat, and to give you a little life hack here. All UC Press books have this little button underneath them where you can press on a link and get a 30% discount. There's nothing secret about this. It's all right off the book's website. So in just a few minutes before we move on to the main event of this third section, which is the contributor, my colleague Antonia, I want to basically just kind of highlight three things that jumped to my mind when I was thinking about this project that has culminated in this wide-ranging source book on conversion to Islam in the pre-modern period. There are a few less obvious things that I wanted to call your attention to that I really like about this book. There are also some things that I think, some areas where I think our book makes room for further study and exploration. That's the nice way of putting it. The less nice way is things that about conversion that we didn't quite get to in this book, and that I would encourage you or your students to look into as you're moving forward. And then also just to say a word or two about the pedagogical potential. So a few of the less obvious things that I think this book does well and that really excite me about the publication. This book reflects a wide swath of the work being done today on conversion to Islam across a huge geographical and temporal range, as well as different methodologies from literary studies, historical studies, approaches informed by social sciences and so forth. And it manages to do this without being kind of a dry, settled survey. So it gives a glimpse of a lot of the work being done and a lot of the sources that are out there on conversion in a way that I think has the potential to draw in students who are, and readers who are curious and analytically minded. Another thing that the book does, I think, pretty well is to mix the extra-Islamic and intra-Islamic discourses and perspectives. That is, there are a whole lot of perspectives written by Muslims, which vary quite a bit in their tone, and there are also perspectives from non-Muslim communities of all different descriptions. There are at least 12 different languages represented in the book, a number of them from this third section that I'll talk about in a second. And so I'm really proud of the diversity that this book reflects. Also, the book creates a space, I think, for study and debate and further inquiry. Again, it's not just a dry survey of conversion to Islam. There's a place for surveys. Surveys are important. Surveys are helpful, but they have their limitations. And I think especially for teaching and getting students and readers engaged, it's nice to have these kinds of these sources expertly introduced, expertly translated, that can lead to some head scratching and really rich discussions among students. Now, I had the honor of presiding over the third section of the book, which ranges roughly from the year 1250 of the Common Era down into the early modern period. We sort of tried to stop things around the time of the rise of the major early modern Islamic empires. We were only partly successful in doing that. But there are a few things about this later period, what Marshall Hodgson called the later middle periods, that I think are distinctive and give it a different flavor from the earlier sections that Christian and Uri have talked about. One is that Sufism, Tasawwuf, is everywhere. Not quite everywhere, but I would say in a solid half of the contributions in this section, Sufi sheikhs play some role. That's not entirely new, but it's, I think, a hallmark of this later period in which the Sufi turuq or orders become very prominent in Islamic history. So ACS Peacock has given readers a very interesting source on the Sufi saint, if you will, Sari Saltuk, who's operating in Eastern Europe. Devin DeWeese has a very nice set of accounts in Persian, or from Persian, about Sufi sheikhs operating at the margins in the region of Samarkand and beyond out in Central Asia. Razieddin Akil has given us a very interesting text on conversion and discourses around it in Chishti Sufi circles in South Asia. Another thing that is different about the flavor of this section is that we see Islam spreading to new regions and among new peoples. Yoni Brak has given us a very rich account of the conversion of the Mongol ruler Ghazan Khan in the early 14th century. There are a couple of sources from West Africa, one notably on the conversion of medieval Ghana by an Ibadi scholar from North Africa. And then we also have conversion on the Malabar coast, where Sufis also play a very central role. These are all regions that haven't yet appeared in the source book down to this point. We have conversion accounts from the very eastern reaches of the Islamic world. Roni Ricci and Alexander Wayne gave us tales about conversion to Islam in Indonesia and Malaysia, respectively, where the discourse around conversion is very heavily interwoven with South Asian and East Asian literary motifs. And I could go on, but like the other editors, I don't have time, unfortunately, to mention all the wonderful contributions here. A couple other things, there are more surviving documents that we have from this later period. So we have some wonderful documentary sources from Sanja Kadrić from Ottoman Istanbul. So documentary accounts of conversion among palace personnel. And then the last thing that I noticed, which is maybe a little bit more debatable, but this later period also features a kind of new prominence of the discursive subject There's more ego writing. There seems to be more self-awareness in the texts, many of the texts that we have from this period. So one example, Clint Hackenberg gave us one of the texts from the famous Anselm Turmeda or Abdullah Tarjuman, and there are very interesting aspects of self-awareness evident in that text. And then even more prominently, Tamer Alefi translated wonderful brief snippets from the ego documents of Ibn Tulun and Ibn Tawq from late 15th and 16th century Syria, that really are kind of daily diaries in which the conversion of various non-Muslim groups and individuals to Islam becomes very prominent. So there are a few areas in which I think that there's room for further work on conversion, even just in kind of presenting sources. So I encourage you, as you're using this book, as you're reading it, as you're recommending it to others, to think not only about what it does, but on the work that remains to do. For instance, we made a decision early on not to focus on intra-Islamic conversions, not to focus on Muslims gravitating towards various streams within Sunni or Shi'i Islam, or to Tasawwuf, to Sufism, or to Falsafa, for instance. We also, other than on the cover with the beautiful illustration of Sheikh San'an and the Christian maiden from the Mantiq al-Tayr of the Persian tradition of Attar, we didn't really feature, Nimrod is holding up the cover there. We didn't feature a whole lot of visual art. There's room for further work there, but it happens that our expertise is in history and in texts. And we also didn't get to cover a lot from the realms of architecture and archaeology. A recent workshop we held virtually here in Jerusalem featured contributions from Mattia Guidetti and Dionigi Albera, both of whom have worked on the conversion of sacred spaces in the early Islamic period and in the Mediterranean. And not only sacred spaces, but other kinds of spaces that change as populations shift their affiliation from one religion to another. So I'll just close by noting what I'm most excited about overall with the appearance of this book, and that is the opportunity to teach from it and to use it as kind of a site of discussion and debate. Because of the broad range of the sources and the deep expertise of all of our contributors who've introduced their translations of those sources, we have here ample opportunities for close readings, for comparing and contrasting exercises, for historical contextualization, all of the things that those of us who teach regularly like to do in the classroom, and that really help students to get their feet wet, not only in kind of knowing facts about conversion that they can regurgitate on an exam, but also in honing their analytical skills and even taking steps into doing research of their own, which is what the further reading section at the end of each of our almost 60 contributions is intended to facilitate. And this complexity and this wealth that I hope will draw students in is nowhere on display in more detail or in a more interesting way, I think, than in the contribution that we'll hear about in just a moment from Antonia. And on that note, I will hand things back to Nimrod, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luke. Thank you for raising what the book does and doesn't do, and for emphasizing Sufism and ego writing, two very important issues that come up. And now we will move to Antonia Bosanquet, who is a research associate at the Roman Islam Center at the University of Hamburg. Her current research addresses conversion and religious dissidence in 9th century North Africa, with particular focus on the spread of Ibadism in the border regions of the Abbasid Empire. She wrote her PhD at the Freie Universität Berlin 2016 on one of the earliest legal compendia dedicated specifically to the topic of Jews and Christians living under Islamic rule. Ahkam al-Dhimma by Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, is an unprecedented for the range and detail of rulings that it contains relating to how Christian and Jewish subjects should interact with Muslims and with the Islamic society in which they live. Antonia's study highlighted the relevance of space to Ibn Qayyim's presentation of these rulings in his view of religious differences. Her book, Minding Their Place, Space and Religious Hierarchy in Ibn Qayyim's Ahkam al-Dhimma, was published by Brill in 2020. She has published several academic articles, including in the Journal of Islamic Law and Society, a study of Ibn Qayyim's approach to a woman's conversion to Islam after marrying a Jewish or Christian man. Antonia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just to check, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's good. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. And I want to start as well by saying thank you to all the editors of this wonderful book. It was a really enjoyable experience contributing to it. And the book itself is really fantastic. I really enjoyed reading through it, and I'm really looking forward to teaching it with the students, especially as it's so accessible for people who don't read Arabic. So the translation that I did, or my entry, was a translation of part of a legal ruling about female conversion to Islam if the woman is already married to a Christian or a Jewish man. And the discussion is by Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, or Ibn al-Qayyim for short. He's really well known in the Islamic world today. You can find his works in most Islamic bookshops, and he's quoted a lot in sermons and other texts. I think he's actually got a fan club on Facebook and even a Twitter page. So he's really popular in the contemporary Muslim world. I don't think he was as popular in the time that he was writing in 14th century Damascus. Maybe because he was a follower of Ibn Taymiyyah, who was quite a controversial figure, or maybe because the Hanbali legal school that he belonged to wasn't the main law school in 14th century Damascus, or maybe just because he wasn't really a limelight-seeking person. His biographers describe him as quite shy and retiring, and he doesn't seem to have tried to play an important role in the public life of Damascus. Anyway, he wrote a lot on a variety of subjects, and the passage that I translated is from a legal book that he wrote called Ahkam al-Dhimma. And this is a collection of rulings, or ahkam, for Jews and Christians living under Islamic rule. So they are the Ahl al-Dhimma, or the Dhimmis. And the book is interesting because it contains quite a lot of unusual rulings and arguments. And one of these is Ibn al-Qayyim's ruling on the wife's conversion and the question of whether she can stay married to her husband after she converts. So as you know, Islamic law doesn't allow a Muslim woman to marry a non-Muslim man. A Muslim man can marry a Jewish or a Christian woman, but if a Muslim woman marries a man who isn't Muslim, then the marriage is invalid. The problem is how to proceed if the pair are already married when the woman converts. Is she then automatically divorced from her husband? And if so, what are the corollaries of this? By the time that Ibn al-Qayyim was writing in the 14th century, most jurists agreed that the couple should be divorced if the man didn't convert as well. They treat the woman's conversion in the same way as the first pronunciation of divorce by the husband. So in Islamic law, when a husband divorces his wife, the divorce isn't final until the iddah, or the waiting period, has finished. And the iddah lasts for 3 months, or the time that it takes for the woman to have 3 menstrual periods. And that's to make sure that she's not pregnant at the time of the divorce. So if the husband changes his mind during this iddah, or waiting period, then he can revoke the divorce and the marriage goes on as previously. With regard to a Christian or Jewish woman who converts to Islam, if the husband converts during the iddah, then the marriage between the converted wife and the converted husband also goes on as previously. It's just that they're now Muslims instead of Christians or Jews or what they were before. So by the time that Ibn al-Qayyim was writing, there was a general consensus that the woman's conversion initiated divorce proceedings. And then if the husband converted within 3 months of the wife's conversion, the divorce did not take place and the marriage went on as previously. If he didn't convert by the end of 3 months, the divorce was final. So basically, the man could decide by converting or not converting whether he wanted to keep his marriage, and the woman didn't have much say in the question. So Ibn al-Qayyim ignores this consensus. He says that there's a great variety in the teachings about the marriage of female converts, and he lists 9 different positions that the early Muslim generations took up on the subject. And then he writes about which position he thinks is more correct, and he explains why. And actually, his interpretation of this position is fascinating because he departs not only from what jurists say on this question of the female convert and marriage, but from views about marriage and sex and divorce more generally. Firstly, he gives the decision about whether the couple should be divorced or stay married to the wife who has converted, in addition to the husband. So most of the other jurists ruling on this question say that the marriage continues automatically if the husband converts to Islam as well, meaning that it's the husband who decides whether or not he wants to stay married to his wife. By contrast, Ibn al-Qayyim says that the woman can decide whether she wants to wait for her husband to convert, or whether she would prefer to be divorced immediately and marry somebody else. And by giving the woman this option, he's actually letting her choose whether to continue her marriage or not. Of course, her husband is free to divorce her as well, but she has much more say in the matter than she does according to the other rulings. And obviously, in the time that Ibn al-Qayyim was writing, divorce in general would be initiated by the husband, not the wife. So his ruling here is really unusual. The other thing that's unusual about Ibn al-Qayyim's argument is that he allows the woman to stay married to her husband, even if he doesn't convert. So instead of saying that she can wait 3 months for her husband to convert, and then he either becomes Muslim as well or they divorce, Ibn al-Qayyim says she can wait for as long as she wants. And while she's waiting for him to convert, she is her husband's wife in almost every sense of the word. So she lives in his house and she receives money from him as she would do as his wife, but she's not allowed to have sexual intercourse with him until he converts as well. Whether he converts after 2 months or 2 years or 20 years isn't important in Ibn al-Qayyim's view. He says that the iddah, or the waiting period of 3 months, isn't relevant to ending marriages after conversion. So the husband doesn't have any time limit by which he has to convert. And again, this is very unusual, not only because of the way that Ibn al-Qayyim just dismisses the relevance of the waiting period here, but also because he distinguishes between marriage and sexual relations, whereas most jurists see the two as inseparable. And so, of course, for me, the interesting question is why did Ibn al-Qayyim make this ruling? And I think there's lots of answers to that question. But actually, instead of summarizing them myself, I should perhaps read a little bit from the translation, because Ibn al-Qayyim himself explains some of his motivations for this ruling. I'll begin by reading my translation of Ibn al-Qayyim's presentation of the 9th ruling. As I said, he lists 9 different rulings or answers to the question of a female convert's marriage, and I translated all 9 rulings in the entry for the Sourcebook, but I'll just read the 9th one here because that's the one that Ibn al-Qayyim is trying to persuade his readers is the correct one. And as you'll notice, he refers to the earlier legal authorities that have transmitted this view, and I've identified them in the translation, but for the sake of time, I'll just pass over the names here. So, Dawood ibn Ali said, if the wife of the dhimmi converts, but he, i.e. the dhimmi husband, does not, she may stay with him, but he may not have sexual intercourse with her. Yarbrough said, Hamed ibn Abi Sulaiman told us on the authority of Ibrahim an-Nakhai about a Dhimmi woman who converted while married to a Dhimmi man. He said, she stays with him. And this is the ruling of Hamed ibn Abi Sulaiman. I say, and this is a signal that Ibn al-Qayyim himself is now going to give his own opinion. I say, what they mean is that the contractual obligations of marriage are upheld. The wife is owed her cost of living and the right to live under her husband's roof, but he is not permitted to engage in sexual intercourse with her. And then Ibn al-Qayyim explains why this ruling is better than the other 8 rulings that he also lists. It's quite a complicated argument, but he summarizes it at the end of his discussion. So I'll read the translation of his summary as well, because it shows what factors influence him to take this position. If the wife chooses to wait for her husband's conversion, she may do so, however long this takes. And if she chooses to marry another man after her iddah has ended, she has the right to do this. The purpose of the iddah in this instance is to preserve the sperm of the first husband. So just to explain, that means to make sure that she's not pregnant from her first husband before she marries her second husband. And Ibn al-Qayyim continues, and if either party converts to Islam during the iddah or after it, the marriage continues. This is unless the man chooses divorce, in which case he may divorce her, as Umar divorced the 2 non-Muslim wives of his when God revealed the verse, do not hold on to your marriages with unbelieving women. Or unless the wife chooses to marry a different man after ascertaining that she is not pregnant by her first husband. She has the right to do this. So here's a clear confirmation that the wife can end the marriage and marry somebody else if she wants to. Ibn al-Qayyim then addresses the ruling put by other jurists that the couple should be separated as soon as the wife converts to Islam. And he rejects this ruling, saying, furthermore, this ruling about immediate separation, this discourages conversion to Islam. For if the wife or the husband knows that their marriage will end upon conversion and that they will have to leave their loved one, and that the husband cannot regain his wife except by renegotiating the marriage with her and with her guardian and by offering a new bride price, he or she will reject conversion. By contrast, if they both know that when the husband converts, the marriage can continue and that they will not be separated unless one of them chooses so, this will draw them towards Islam and endear the religion to them, which makes it more likely that they will convert. So at the end of this section, we see that the main motivation for Ibn al-Qayyim's unusual ruling is his concern to encourage conversion to Islam and his view that enabling the marriage between a convert and her husband is more likely to have this effect than increasing the pressure and obstacles that the couple have to go through. For the sake of encouraging conversion, he's prepared to bend other principles about marriage, but he's not prepared to go so far as to permit sexual intercourse between a Muslim woman and a non-Muslim man. So I'll stop there because of the time limits, but it's a fascinating ruling, and it's also fascinating to look what happens to this ruling from the time that Ibn al-Qayyim writes it in the 14th century up until today, or 2012, when it begins to become quite popular. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antonia, for presenting us such an interesting legal thinker, such as Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, and for the internal dynamics and the disagreements. I think it's very important to understand that anybody who studies Islamic law knows this, that there's very intense discussions and disagreements. And thank you very much for bringing this forward on this specific topic. And lastly, we have a guest speaker, and we're delighted to have her with us. This is Mercedes Garcia Arenal, who is a cultural and religious historian focusing mainly on religious minorities in the Iberian world and the Mediterranean in the early modern period. She has authored and co-authored several books edited and directed many others as product of her research projects that she has led, and published an extensive number of learned articles and important journals in English, French, and Spanish. Most of her work is concerned with studying the establishment of frontiers between groups and how individuals manage to cross them, paying special attention to the capillarity of these frontiers and to the new phenomena of cross-cultural mobility. She has worked mostly with Islamic minorities in Iberia, but also with Jews and Judeo-conversos in Iberia, as well as Jews and Jewish converts to Islam in Islamic lands. As such, throughout her career, she has been interested, either directly or indirectly, in religious conversion at both the individual and collective level. She has produced an innovative view on the dynamics of cultural change and exchange in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and the entanglement of different religions in Iberia. In so doing, she has challenged prevailing assumptions that religious change is driven by autochthonous forces within traditions, accounting for the impact that interaction had on their historical developments. Her work also challenges the polarized description of majority and minority groups on multiple levels and questions scholars' reproduction of these polarized patterns. She has been a principal investigator of the ERC Conversion, Overlapping Religiosities, Polemics, and Interaction, and is now the principal coordinator of the European Quran. She's a member of the Scientific Council of European Research Council and corresponding member of the American Medieval Academy. Some of the products of her works and the projects, such as the advanced project that I just mentioned before, are books such as After Conversion, Iberia and the Emergence of Modernity, which was published with Brill in 2016. And with Yonatan Glaser Eitan, she published Forced Conversion in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in Brill 2010. Her book, authored with Joad Weigaz, A Man of Three Worlds, Samuel Palash, a Moroccan Jew in Catholic and Protestant Europe, has been translated into several languages and is about to appear in Hebrew. So thank you very much for joining us, Mercedes, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nimrod. And thank you to the organizers of this reunion and for inviting me to be a part of it. Let me begin by saying that this book is an extraordinary book. And I feel privileged by being here and by having receiving it so soon after its publication, and to have had the time to read it and reread it at leisure, something that I will keep doing and use it in my teaching. It is presented as a source book, but it is, for me, more than that. It is a mine to be dig into once and again. It is an achievement that opens new venues and begs for further research in a field that the book as a whole shows under new lights of richness and diversity. As it's been said here, it is built upon a close examination of the documentary traces left by conversion. Criticizing the notion that we can approach the experience of conversion independently from its representation, scholars working on conversion to Christianity in pre-modern Europe and the Mediterranean, such as Carl Morrison, Jean-Claude Smith, or Ryan Spitz, have explored the extent to which conversion is embedded in textual conventions and theological paradigms. As these scholars show, what we understand as the experience of conversion is intertwined in, indeed inseparable from, the media and cultural models through which it is rendered legible. The text selected here in the book give evidence of those processes to which the editors are attentive and sensitive to. However, since the term conversion is very much a point of contention in historiography, as you all well know, let me first try to clarify the meanings ascribed to it, especially as they relate to notions of will and compulsion, on which I am personally interested. Conversion has a long history of being used to describe religious change. The question is, of course, what is the nature of this change? It is an event or a process, a communal change or an individual experience? Was the subject of conversion actively looking for new religious meaning? Or was the convert passive victim of circumstances? Is conversion, in the final analysis, spiritual or social? Conversion can be all of those things and more, as the book presented here today shows. Viewed from the perspective of change, massive or forced conversion is a seismic moment in the history of religions. Caroline Walker Bynum, who turned to medieval stories of conversion in her search for new ways of imagining identity, has pointed to two fundamentally different ways of conceptualizing change. One was hybridization, the mixing of old and new. Another was a full metamorphosis. The later ideas echoes the notion, Arthur Nock, among others, of conversion as a complete change. But the tensions produced by general conversion prompt us to think that it may be better considered to be a hybrid change. Indeed, as Jean-Claude Schmitt has argued, conversion transforms but does not erase. The marks of the past of difference remain to some extent and can always resurface. The hybrid change is what we get very clearly after reading the book we are presenting here today. This hybrid change, for me, the question that the book launches and I believe answers, maybe only partially, is how does our view of the rise of Islam changes if we take seriously the fact that Muslims remained a demographic minority for much of the Middle Ages. And to follow in the way opened by Jacques Tanous, one of your contributors, in his recent book, The Making of the Medieval Middle East, Religion, Society, and Simple Believers, how people of different religions coexisted in various situations and how far converts were really conscious of making a major shift in the religious allegiance. This book brings abundant material to those questions and to other questions that concern me particularly and on which I'm going to focus, because what else can I say that the editors have not said in their introductions and their talks now? I am interested in the nature of change brought about by conversion, especially forced conversion, and therefore on the questions of will and compulsion and coercion and faith. They are related to my mind to the question of hybridity versus transformation. And most especially to what I am working now at the moment, as Nimrod has said, how large numbers of converts affect or transform not only the society, but even the faith that receives them. Forcible conversion of large populations has been frequently mentioned by historians in the context of great religious transformations and big changes in civilization. The conversion of the Middle East and the Mediterranean to Christianity is one that comes to mind, of course, the spread of Islam, or the conversion of the Franks under Clovis, of the early modern evangelization of the New World, or the European, or as Diana Christic argues, Ottoman confessionalization processes. In all those cases, recent scholars working on it have moved away, as this book does, from older historiographic narratives of conversion by the sword. Instead, they emphasized how conversion was often a slow, gradual process that involved broad cultural change and institutional and disciplinary indoctrination. In these processes, political pragmatism, converts' agency, the power of local traditions and topographies led many times to the creation of hybrid negotiated religiosities. The use of coercion is generally discussed in this literature as a problem of power relations in the encounter between cultures, not as an issue with profound consequences for the very definition of faith, something I have been working upon for a time, as I said. In a book recently edited by Jonathan Glaser-Aitan and myself that Nimrod mentioned, Forced Conversion in Christianity, in Judaism, Christianity and Islam. In this book, everyone that participated in it, we try to historize the very categories of will and coercion and to analyze the process through which coercion was legitimized by or reconciled with a particular conception of faith. Instead of looking at the individual experience of forced conversion, we inquired in that book into the emergence of identitary categories. We argue in this book that forced conversion has dramatic effects not only upon those coerced to accept a new faith, but also on the group who imposed its faith upon others and admitted the neophytes into its fold. The body of the faithful becomes more permeable and changeable, leading to anxieties about purity and pollution. We can see in this context the mechanism devised and the attempts made by religious and political authorities to integrate these neophytes. But we can likewise identify efforts and institutional means to marginalize and exclude them. In these circumstances, we can detect what for Spanish Christian David Nirenberg has termed genealogical mentalities. In Iberia, lineage became one of the dominant means to establish a person's true faith and loyalty, and religion became increasingly associated with ethnicity. This was true in Catholic Spain of Inquisition and the purity of blood laws, as it was in Umayyad time in Al-Andalus with their Arab lineages, or in the Berber Almohads. Through the Almohads and many others after them, we also see how certain modes of exegesis favored the justification of forcibly imposing Islam upon non-Muslims or a particular persuasion of Islam. As in this book, with the case of medieval Egypt, we see different types of justification for forced conversion to Islam in examples such as Ibn Hazm of Cordoba radical universalism, or in the relationship between Messianic and political ideologies discussed by Maribel Fierro for the Almohads and for myself. These exegetical choices were of course not made in a vacuum, but were intrinsically related to the nature and ideology of diverse religious and political movements within Islam. I will pass now to another, the last aspect, related with what I said was lately my main point of interest, and in which I have found so much material in your book, what I named the entanglement of religions rather than hybridity, which includes the coming and going and reinterpreting of religious tenets of one religion, coming across the religious boundaries and coming back again, and in so doing obliging both religious groups, specifically the one integrating the convert, to redefine some of its dogmatic religious borders. I will propose two examples here. Both have to do with converts. According to several Iberian sources, the Moriscos, the forcibly converted Muslims to Catholicism in Iberia, used to say each person is saved in its own law. There is, according to innumerable Inquisition trials and treaties of polemics against Islam, They were apparently basing this affirmation in Quran 5:69 or Quran 2:26, which says, whoever believes in Allah and does good, they shall have no fear, nor shall have they grief. Even those who are Jews and Sabians and Christians. In popular Morisco levels, this was translated by the dictum, cada uno se salva en su ley. Each one can attain salvation following its respective law. This was persecuted by the Inquisition as a negation of the Catholic dogma that maintains that only inside the Catholic realm can salvation be achieved. Christian anti-Islamic polemicists made of this dictum a sign of identity, a sign of crypto-Islam. But it was more than anything the expression of a feeling that many converts, forcibly converted from Judaism or from Islam, shared. And it was the anguish that their parents and grandparents will go to hell. One of the many aspects of what Peter Webb has named the pain of what the convert leaves behind. So this anguish that their parents and grandparents will go to hell. And it was really a cause for anxiety among the first generations of converts in Iberia. It is difficult to know if this assertion that each one is saved in its own law was a response or a polemical response to the assertion of Catholicism, or from mitigating this pain of one's parents' doom. But I want to underline here that this Morisco argument is used once and again in Catholic Iberian sources to maintain that libertad de conciencia, freedom of conscience, is something Muslim and it's proper of the Ottomans, and that Catholic Spain should refrain of doing that. And I'm also working in different kind of materials because I think this amount of converts entering and worrying about their parents is one of the reasons why limbo gets to be such a big theme in 16th century Catholic Europe. And I want to connect this example with another similar example that to my mind is also connected to the pain that converts have about the afterlife of their parents. David Bertaina, in his contribution to a recent conference for our UQ project on the European Quran, looked at two examples of how debates between Muslim theologians of the Abbasid periods were taken up by Arab Christian polemicists and subsequently made their way into Latin Christian readings of the Quran. He looked in particular at the question of the practice of idolatry associated with Muhammad's parents and with the young Muhammad himself before his calling to prophethood at the age of 14. Quran 9:113 reads, "It is not for the prophet and those who have believed to ask forgiveness for the polytheist, even if they were relatives, after it has become clear to them that they are companions of hellfire." Some hadith in the tradition of providing occasions for revelation explain that Muhammad was seen weeping at his mother's grave and said that he had wanted to offer prayers for the salvation of her soul, but that God had refused. Muhammad himself had been rescued from idolatrous practice by God's grace. The Islamic debate about the status of Muhammad's parents and his state of grace prior to prophethood had implications for medieval Latin theologians, due in large part to the Muslim convert to Coptic Orthodoxy known as Bulus Ibn Raja. Having studied this text, Muqtasili text mainly, in Fatimid Cairo as a Muslim, Ibn Raja repurposed the Quranic debate but by agreeing that Muhammad, prior to his prophethood, and his parents were polytheists, doubting that his could be authentic, since he was not preserved from sin, as it was the case of the Virgin Mary. Indeed, the Gospels assess the purity and freedom from sin of Mary and Jesus, and the Quran concurs, Quran 3:19. Eventually, the substance of these arguments were used by Latin writers such as Ramon Martí and Ricoldo da Monte da Croce. This apparent small bit information, though very interesting to the consideration of converts, integrates, in my opinion, a whole complex of anti-Muslim polemics, of which I am also working, that enhance in Catholicism to unexpected levels the figure of the Virgin Mary, immaculate and devoid of original sin. The case of Mary is an extraordinary vantage point to observe a particular kind of what I have termed the entanglement of religions, independent or coexisting with hybridity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. Thank you for a fascinating and wide-ranging talk. I have to admit that one of the things that I found the most interesting was the notion of a hybrid, the hybrid situation, and all the social complexities that it brings forth, as well as many other ideas that came up in this talk. I would also like to thank the speakers for their overviews and the rich sources that they presented to us. I think this was a very short example. These are short examples of the huge range of sources that we have in this book, and the different flavors and nuances that can come up from these sources. And lastly, I would like just to say that these are actually quite difficult times here in Israel, as many of us are sitting in different places to guard ourselves, and as shooting is taking place into Gaza and out of Gaza into Israel. And all I can say is that I hope that this clash will reach its end as quickly as possible and with as few casualties as possible. We have gone beyond our time. So I would like again to thank all of you for the participation. It's been, for me, a fascinating evening. And I look forward to meeting all of you in the different occasions that we have, and when times will go back to normal, both in Israel and in the world for different reasons. So thank you very much. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for the speakers. And I hope to see you again very soon. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.